many other...
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and coming up we've got the latest on a whole raft of international stories. We will keep a major focus on the United Nations General Assembly in New York and key meetings taking place on the sidelines of UNGA. We'll start with the headlines. As Prime Minister Modi heads to the US to attend UNGA and hold a one-on-one with US President Joe Biden, WION speaks to Indian envoy to the US, Taranjit Singh Sandhu, who wants to highlight steadily growing Indo-US ties.
Direct telephone calls between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. That was followed by two top-level summits which were held. On both of them, Prime Minister Modi was the prominent speaker.
The defence technology partnership that you've led and with our Australian friends, that I think has great potential to benefit the whole of the world.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson meets US President Joe Biden amid the diplomatic row with France. Both Biden and Johnson hail the submarine deal and AUKUS strategic partnership between Britain, Australia and the United States. In his UNGA address, Xi Jinping claims China has never and will never bully or invade others. The Chinese president also appears to hit out at the Quad and NATO, saying the world should reject forming small groups. The Taliban's foreign minister writes to the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres and seeks to speak during the annual high-level meeting at the UNGA. In a revised travel advisory, the United Kingdom accepts Covishield jabs as approved vaccines. However, Indians vaccinated with 2 doses would still need to quarantine due to the UK's issue with Indian vaccine certificates. And Brazil's Health Minister Marcelo Queiroga tests positive for COVID-19. This after having attended the UN General Assembly in New York, inaugurated by the unvaccinated Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. And we'll start with those White House talks between US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They came hours after Joe Biden had addressed the UN General Assembly. Both Biden and Johnson hailed the AUKUS deal and the strategic partnership between Britain, Australia and the United States. Johnson said the creation of the alliance has great potential to benefit the whole world. Neither Johnson nor Biden mentioned the diplomatic strife with France and the European Union after the pact was revealed.
And we've seen some great progress just in the last. Then, of course, there's the progress that we're making in the defence technology partnership that you've led and with our Australian friends, that I think has great potential to benefit the whole of the world and the security of the whole of the world. So, Joe, thank you for having us, and I think we're boosting our shared agenda. We want to build back the world together with you, and I think we want to renew and strengthen our transatlantic bond, and it feels to me like it's going very, very well.
We're going to also, our economies have to work together, including through our Build Back Better World initiative that we launched at Carbis Bay. And today we're going to discuss the next steps on all of this, and as well as how the U.S. and U.K. can continue our cooperation in Afghanistan and the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
Both Biden and Johnson are also attempting to galvanise countries around the world to set ambitious emissions reduction targets. Johnson praised Biden for placing the issue high on his agenda. Biden told the visiting Prime Minister he looked forward to coming to the United Kingdom for the COP26 conference on global warming later this year. Under his administration, the US has renewed pledges to cut greenhouse gases and promised to finance projects to combat climate change.
Earlier today, I addressed the United Nations General Assembly, and I made clear that climate has to be the core area of action for all of us. And as we look ahead to the UK-hosted COP26, which I'm really anxious to attend in Glasgow in November, Mr. Prime Minister.
But I think the most important thing today has been your speech, Joe, to UNGA, where you made a commitment on supporting the world to adapt to climate change, doubling the American commitment. That's very important for us. We've made a £11.6 billion commitment I made when I first became Prime Minister, but it's fantastic to see the United States really stepping up and showing a lead, a real lead.
The British Prime Minister also thanked Joe Biden for lifting a ban on British beef and on travel for Europeans who've received 2 doses of COVID vaccine.
Real action to the UK-hosted COP26, which I'm really anxious to attend in Glasgow in November.
But while Britain and the US may have committed to cooperate in various sectors, a free trade agreement between the two countries looks unlikely to come through in the near future. In the meeting with UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Joe Biden refrained from any commitment to a free trade agreement. He said the issue was still under discussion. The US President has also warned that he, along, he says, with many Republicans, would not like to see a change in the Irish peace accords following the UK's exit from the European Union. Biden insisted that those are actually 2 different subjects.
President Trump said that the UK was in front of the queue when it came to a trade deal. You seem to have a different approach. Is that because of your heritage, your concern about the Irish protocol? Is that what's holding it back when it comes to doing this deal with the UK?
There are 2 separate issues. On the deal with the UK, that's continued to be discussed. But on the protocols, I feel very strongly about those. We spent an enormous amount of time and effort in the United States. It was a major bipartisan effort made, and I would not at all like to see, nor I might add, would many of my Republican colleagues like to see a change in the Irish Accords, the end result having a closed border again.
Well, the UK also says it doesn't want to see any change in the Irish peace agreements that would harm the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Now, last week, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, did link respecting the peace agreement in Northern Ireland to any trade negotiations with London. The peace agreement in Northern Ireland helps provide an open border with the Republic. The Boris Johnson government is still involved in post-Brexit negotiations with the European Union over customs arrangements for Northern Ireland, which it considers not to be working satisfactorily. Before the 2 leaders met, Boris Johnson indicated that he does not expect a free trade agreement with the United States to come through before the next UK general election, which is due in 2024. Johnson told reporters travelling to the US with him that Joe Biden has too many domestic priorities to find time to negotiate a trade deal with the UK. A trade deal with the US was billed by some Brexit campaigners as one of the prizes of leaving the EU, so Boris Johnson is under pressure to prove that the biggest upheaval in Britain's foreign policy in the last 50 years was worth it. For more, let's go to Benji Hire, who is joining us live from London now. And Benji, how big a blow is it to Boris Johnson that he's not making much progress towards that US-UK trade deal?
Well, look, Ollie, I don't think many, and even Boris Johnson admitted this himself, would have expected the Prime Minister to have gone to Washington and returned to the UK with a trade deal signed, sealed and delivered. But certainly he was hoping, and the British government was hoping, for some progress. And when the questions were put to Mr Biden about whether Britain would be back at the end of the line, back at the end of the queue, the President's response was, we're still going to have to work that through. So clearly a number of stumbling blocks that are still in the way. And that reference to being at back of the line was, of course, a mention by President Obama, the former American president, kind of warning Britain against leaving the European Union in the fear that if they did so, the UK wouldn't be able to immediately sign up to some sort of trade agreement with the US. That would take a very long time, and that's proving to certainly be the case. You also mentioned in your introduction that Northern Ireland Protocol, something really close to the President's heart. And until that's resolved, again, politicians on both sides of the political aisle in America might be reluctant to actually agree anything with the United Kingdom. With all that said, Boris Johnson will come back to the United Kingdom with some positives. He has secured that lifting, or at least President Biden has made that decision to lift that ban on British beef. There's been a change to export rules in regard to tariffs on whiskey, for example, and a resolution to a long battle between Boeing and Airbus as well. And then also a mention from an official spokesperson from the British government, which is that there could be a potential effort to get Britain involved in the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's between the US, Canada and Mexico, as some sort of route in to try to secure that direct deal with the United States. But plenty of work still needs to be done in that regard.
OK, and what about relations, Benji, between the two men, but also their countries, which have faced some recent difficulties, it has to be said. Has Boris Johnson's visit to the US yielded positive signs about that so-called special relationship?
Yeah, on the two men themselves, I mean, it's an interesting one. President Biden famously mentioned that, or famously called Boris Johnson, I should say, a kind of physical and emotional clone of former President Donald Trump. And I don't think he meant that in a very complimentary way. But it's important not to look too much into the personal. The fact is that Boris Johnson did get his visit to the White House, and when he was there, warm words were exchanged, even on very sensitive issues like Afghanistan. Boris Johnson highlighting how actually the US had done a solid job in many of the ways in which they withdrew from the country. And so a concerted effort to try and maintain that so-called special relationship, especially when it comes to climate change. And really, I think there's an interest from both sides here, not to get into any sort of diplomatic spat or indeed throw insults one way or another. Both the UK and the US need to come out of this with some sort of progress, recognition, positive rhetoric when it comes to climate change, with only weeks to go until that all-important United Nations COP26 climate summit, which is being hosted by the UK. And so, again, warm words exchanged on that point too. And finally, a mention of AUKUS, that new alliance, that defence pact between the UK, Australia and the United States. Again, a recognition of the close relationship between the two countries, the shared values they have, and certainly a pointing towards a closeness of relationship across the North Atlantic. Then, in addition, if I may add, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden united on their passion for many different things, including trains, funnily enough. So warm words exchanged on that too. And Boris Johnson will be hoping and feeling that he has got closer to the US president, someone that, again, there has been an exchange of words between them on some controversial notes.
OK, Benji, thank you. Well, Benji was talking about the AUKUS strategic alliance between Australia, the US and the UK, which caught many by surprise. Besides France, some Asian countries are concerned about Australia's plans to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Others have welcomed the deal.
Great friends of freedom and of Australia. never alone.
The new military alliance between the US, the UK and Australia is continuing to fuel tensions. Under the deal, Australia will acquire nuclear-powered submarines from the US and scrap a contract for the purchase of conventional French submarines. The scrapping of the multi-billion-dollar submarine contract has triggered a diplomatic crisis. MIFT France has cancelled a Franco-British Defence Ministers Summit, which was due to take place this week. It earlier recalled its ambassadors to the United States and Australia in a display of displeasure. European allies are rallying around France. Berating the United States, Germany said France's diplomatic crisis with the US was a wake-up call on the importance of standing united.
Of course, I understand the disappointment of our French partners, and we are in close contact here. It is once again a wake-up call for all of us in the European Union to ask how we can strengthen our sovereignty. We can act unanimously even on issues relevant to external and security policy, and how we can also put our economic weight, our political weight, on the scales in such a way that we can contribute to security for multilateralism, and so that our values are firmly anchored on the global level.
The dispute will also be at the top of the EU's political agenda, including at an EU summit next month. But European Union nations are not the only ones upset about the new security pact. The divide over the pact runs much deeper. Some South Asian nations are also worried. The partnership could provoke China and spur a regional arms race. Over the last decade, nations in the Indo-Pacific have found it increasingly difficult to navigate between the two superpowers. Indonesia was the first country in the region to criticize the arrangement, saying it was deeply concerned over the continuing arms race in the region. The Australian Prime Minister had already been forced to cancel his recent trip to Jakarta after the Indonesian Prime Minister said he would be unavailable to meet. Malaysia says it is worried AUKUS could provide other powers to act more aggressively, especially in the South China Sea. Morrison called his Malaysian counterpart to explain that the formation of the group was to help Canberra acquire nuclear-powered submarines. In sharp contrast, the Philippines has maintained neutrality, saying that it hoped it can maintain balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. ASEAN nations strive to maintain Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality, and free from interference by any outside powers. The member states also signed a treaty back in 1995, which committed to keep nuclear weapons out of the region. The ASEAN states are concerned over the China-US rivalry playing out in the South China Sea. With the AUKUS deal, they worry that a conflict may be sparked in the region. Both Indonesia and Malaysia have had run-ins with Chinese ships in the South China Sea. Adding Australian nuclear-powered submarines in the mix could have the potential to change the power dynamics. The deal is likely to be the highlight of an ASEAN summit scheduled in October. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also met Amazon founder Jeff Bezos on the sidelines of the UNGA. Johnson and Bezos discussed taxes and hopes that progress can be made in implementing the G7 agreement on tax. Boris Johnson says the Amazon boss is not going to pay taxes as an act of kindness and says it's up to governments to make sure that big businesses contribute what is due. Johnson said Bezos made it clear that he believed the onus was on governments to ensure they have an effective tax system. The UK Prime Minister also said the government is trying to make sure it can bring about changes that are fair to the taxpayer, to businesses in the high street and elsewhere. Amazon has sparked anger over minimal tax payments in the UK despite billions in sales. The company paid £492 million in direct taxation in 2020 as its sales rose 50% to over £20 billion. Prime Minister Boris Johnson welcomed Bezos' pledge to give away $1 billion in grants this year to focus on efforts around conservation.
You're giving sanctuaries. Yeah. Are you giving a speech tomorrow? Tonight. Tonight? Yeah, tonight. Oh, goodness. Yeah. Good luck. Fantastic. At the General Assembly? No, at the Climate Week. At the Climate Week. Fantastic. And you're making a big commitment on nature. Trees and... Yes. Nature. Conservation. Yeah. The Amazon is coming to the rescue of the Amazon.
Staying at the UNGA, and in his debut address, US President Joe Biden detailed his vision for leading America into a new era of diplomacy. Biden insisted the United States would seek to counter rising autocracies while avoiding a new Cold War. In his 30-minute address, Biden also called for global action on climate change and the pandemic.
I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations.
U.S. President Joe Biden mapped out a new era of vigorous competition without war in his first United Nations address on Tuesday, a steep departure from the America First policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump.
We will lead on all the greatest challenges of our time, from COVID to climate, peace and security, human dignity and human rights, but we will not go it alone. We will lead together with our allies and partners and in cooperation with all those who believe as we do that this is within our power to meet these challenges.
Biden said he will work to double the United States' financial commitment on climate change and spend $10 billion to fight hunger. While he didn't address China directly, Biden made implicit references to Beijing as the U.S. butts heads with China over trade and human rights issues. He said the United States will compete vigorously, economically, and push democratic systems and rule of law.
We'll stand up for our allies and our friends and oppose attempts by stronger countries to dominate weaker ones, whether through changes to territory by force, economic coercion, technical exploitation, or disinformation. But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs.
Biden came to the United Nations facing criticism at home and abroad for a hasty U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that left some Americans and Afghan allies still in that country and struggling to get out. His vow for allied unity is being tested by a three-way agreement between the United States, Australia, and Britain that undermined a French submarine deal and left France feeling stabbed in the back.
On behalf of the journalists.
Lots more UNGA coverage coming from WION over the next few days. Today, for example, Boris Johnson is addressing the UNGA in New York. A key focus of his speech will be climate ahead of the COP26 climate summit that the UK is hosting in Glasgow in November. Boris Johnson believes that the UK government has achieved some of its aims over the last few days in terms of securing extra American commitments when it comes to funding for poorer countries to do with climate change. He also welcoming the news that China says it won't commit itself to funding coal-powered plants abroad. That is a key area that the UK government has been focusing on as well. So some optimism I expect to hear from Boris Johnson heading into COP26 in November in his speech to the UNGA later today. That, though, is a wrap for this edition of WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Up next, WION's Climate Tracker. Stay tuned to WION for that.
This is right, Arab.